The learning explanation of attachment is one of two explanations of attachment, including learning explanation and Bowlby's explanation. The learning explanation is based on the key ideas of the learning approach. Just a reminder, all learning theory is based on the idea that behavior is learnt, that we're born a blank slate, and therefore everything that we do is acquired through experience. Just a reminder that learning includes behaviorism, that is classical and operant conditioning, that focuses only on observable behavior and empirical evidence. But learning theory includes also social learning theory that does look at mediational processes. Now, in this case, because we're looking at babies are not cognitively developed enough to really consider their motivation and vicarious reinforcement. So although social learning technically is part of learning theory, it would be a weak explanation in the context of attachment. But it would be credit-worthy as a learning explanation. So the idea in the learning explanation, you have to immediately put it in the context of attachment. Don't talk about learning theory and Pavlov's dogs, because that would be out of context. So you talk immediately about how hunger is a primary drive. Babies are born with this need to be fed, to survive, and therefore food is what we would call an unconditioned stimulus that causes an unconditioned response of pleasure. And that is like in Pavlov's dogs. Attachment is seen as a secondary drive that is learnt through an association between the caregiver who provides the food and the satisfaction, the pleasure given by the primary drive that is the food. This is also known, therefore, as cupboard love, because it states that attachment behaviors, remember this is behaviorism, so we're looking at just attachment behaviors, not the emotional element of attachment, are formed through the association of the caregiver with food. So classical conditioning talks specifically about the association between food and the mother. So you want to mention the key word classical conditioning and the key concept of association, and then go on to explain the steps of classical conditioning, bringing in more key words. This is a simple explanation, so you must embed key terminology in your answer to make it credit-worthy. So you talk about the fact that the food is unconditioned stimulus and therefore causes pleasure, an unconditioned response. The mother initially is a neutral stimulus, so the baby doesn't respond to the mother. You could say that, in fairness, in the asocial stage, the babies don't seem to respond specifically to anyone, and even in the indiscriminate stage, the mother still remains a neutral stimulus. Because of the constant association between the mother and the food, whether it's a bottle feeding or whether it's breastfeeding, the baby will start to associate these two stimuli, call them stimuli, keep using the correct terminology, until the mother becomes a conditioned stimulus that causes the response of pleasure, being a conditioned response in response to the mother. So before learning, you want to break it down in before learning, what the food is, during learning, there's this association that happens, and after learning, the mother becomes what we would call a secondary drive or secondary reinforcer. Now you also bring in operant conditioning, that is the second element of behaviorism, and you talk about the concept of learning through consequence. Behavior that is reinforced, that it causes a reward, is repeated. Behavior that removes something unpleasant is repeated, and these are both called reinforcement, positive and negative. And then behavior that creates a negative outcome will not be repeated. So negative reinforcement is the most significant in attachment, and it's interesting because it explains both sides of the relationship. Classical conditioning only explains to us why the baby forms an attachment with the mother, but why does the mother form it with the baby? Operant conditioning fills that gap for us, explaining why also the parent will form an attachment with the baby. And again, we're talking about attachment behaviors. So what is driving the parent to feed the baby, to change the baby, to take care of the baby? And this is explained through negative reinforcement. When the baby cries, that's an unpleasant experience for both the baby, because the baby is in discomfort, but also for the parent, because hearing the crying is disturbing. We're hardwired to really be bothered by a baby's cry more than an adult's cry. And that's why for both parties, when the parent caters for the baby's needs, both of them have that removal of the discomfort of either crying because you are in discomfort or hearing the crying because the baby is in discomfort. So through negative reinforcement, attachment behaviors are repeated for both parties. So seeking proximity, anxiety in strangers, and that kind of reciprocal interactional synchrony, reciprocity, because they both remove the discomfort for both. Now we're going to move on to evaluation of the learning explanation. Now, first of all, you could say learning theory does provide an adequate explanation of how we learn through association and reinforcement. The big problem is not so much how this explanation of removal of discomfort and positive experiences reinforcing the mutual liking between parent and caregiver. It's the focus on food that is challenged the most, because no evidence has supported the view that food is associated with attachment. Never has it been that the person that provides more food becomes automatically the primary attachment figure. So we'll look at the evidence now. Okay? The learning explanations predictions would be exactly that if attachment is formed based on primary care provision, feeding, changing nappies, bathing, then we will see that attachment behavior increases from birth, and that is not untrue. As we said, the asocial stage is followed by the indiscriminate stage and then a specific stage. So you could say that the baby is learning to attach. What is challenged is that the strongest attachment will be with those who provide the most primary care, the ones that do the hands-on feeding, bathing, etc. So here we've got some evidence to challenge the learning explanation. Here we've got 122 children born and raised communally in an Israeli kibbutz, and what they found is that children were cared by nurses. They fed them and they took care of their physical needs. They didn't spend a lot of time with their parents because they grew up communally all together, taken care of mutually by these nurses. However, they still showed a much stronger attachment to their parents than to the nurse. So this study challenges the views of learning theory, saying that the attachment was not formed based on primary care provision, and it's not strongest with the person that provides the most of that primary care. Schaffer and Emerson also challenged those findings because, again, when they found children that had been cared for by nurses or babysitters or nannies, they still found that the infants were most attached to the person who was responsive to their needs and interacted them with sensitivity the most. Sensitivity is not something that the behaviorist explanation or the learning explanation would consider because it's not empirical data. So that's lacking in the explanation, meaning that we can challenge the validity of learning theory because the research doesn't support it and it doesn't offer comprehensive understanding of what attachment really entails. The famous Harlow study, again, is a clear study that you can use to challenge learning behavior because the monkeys presented with a wire mother with the food and the cloth mother with just the comfort chose to spend up to 23 hours a day with the cloth mother that didn't provide the food, showing that physical and social contact rather than food was more important. According to learning theory, again, reinforcement increases the likelihood of behaviors occurring. Again, punishment should repress those behaviors. However, what we find is that in real life, children show strong attachment even when parents punish them, hurt them, and even in abusive parents, we still find that children are attached to them. And therefore, the real world applicability of this theory is virtually non-existent, and it's a theory that would be considered, you can say this for behaviorism, you could say it's reductionist. It narrows down attachment to a stimulus-response transaction based on food and basic primary care, when in fact it's a much more complex phenomenon.